One of the biggest dominoes from Hamilton's move to Ferrari has turned out to be Fernando Alonso. Before the F1 world turned upside down, it seemed almost certain that Alonso would either continue and end his career at Aston Martin, or just retire at the end of this season. Hamilton shaking up the driver market opened up seats that I don't think even Fernando thought would be available, and it opens the possibility of yet another move for Fernando, which, if it were to happen, would be his 7th different team. Coming into this season, Fernando did the thing that he does best outside of driving, and that's talking himself up. Whilst he maintained that Aston Martin is where he wants to be and will be the first team that he talks to when he decides what he wants to do for next year, he also put it out there with a not so subtle line that there are only 3 world champions on the grid and there is only one available. That line to me was just pure and classic Fernando, and it's one of the biggest reasons why I believe that he still belongs on the Formula 1 grid. It's quite ironic looking back because when it was announced that he would come back in 2020, there was a tsunami of creators and fans that questioned why a driver who was already retired and in his late 30s should even be given the chance to come back to Formula 1. I was one of the very few at the time that fully backed for Fernando's comeback to be a success because, as I have consistently said on this channel, age is just a number, and if you're good enough, then age is irrelevant. It was true for Verstappen at the age of 17, and it's true for Alonso now at the age of 42. I think it's important to remember, however, that Fernando Alonso and even Lewis Hamilton to an extent, despite the bad start to the season that he's had, these drivers are not the rule, they are the exception. No driver, in my opinion, in the last 20 or 30 years has been this good at this age, and even when you look at drivers like Verstappen or Leclerc, there is absolutely no certainty that they'll be as good as Fernando and Lewis are now if they decide to race into their late 30s or early 40s. After last season, I ranked Fernando to be in the same tier right now as Max Verstappen, because when Aston Martin briefly had the second best car on the grid, he was maximizing every single race, finishing on the podium 6 times in the first 8 races, and had Max not pulled out a blinding qualifying lap in Monaco to outqualify Fernando by a 10th in a better car, I think Fernando very well could have qualified on pole and could have been a race winner in Monaco. Last year was one of those seasons where most of the teams only had 1 or 2 races where they genuinely could have won a Grand Prix, and that was Aston Martin's. Either way, whether it's comparing to Leclerc, Norris or Sainz, Fernando is still one of the best drivers on the grid, and that is why over the past few years, the talk about his age has gone quieter and quieter because his performances have answered all of the critics. That doesn't mean, however, that he hasn't hinted at possibly retiring at the end of this season, and so I think it's only fair to start at that scenario. And now, personally, given that I started watching Formula 1 during the Alonso, Vettel and Hamilton period, I'm always going to have a special connection to these drivers, and so just from a selfish point of view, I really do hope that Fernando decides to stay. But apart from his on-track performances, which have been sublime and exciting from the overtakes to the last lap battles, I think as a character, he still has something to offer off-track. Whether you love or hate Fernando, and trust me, there is plenty of people on both sides, the one thing that I have never heard people call him is boring. To me, he is still a box office character, whether he's talking himself up, which he loves to do more than anyone else, or just his mischievous personality. There is no one else like Fernando Alonso, and he definitely still adds something different to the grid. In terms of retirement, whilst he openly hasn't ruled it out in recent interviews, it's all going to depend on his motivation, what he still wants to achieve, and what car he can get into in 25. Given that he is the most experienced driver in Formula 1 history who has started more races than anyone else, and has also been in Formula 1 longer than Piastri has even lived, there would be no shame in him choosing to finally hang up his helmet, and he would be doing so still driving at his absolute best, even if the equipment hasn't quite matched his ability. Because Aston Martin have actually regressed this season, I actually think it makes it harder for Alonso to justify staying beyond this season if Aston Martin is his only option, because you've got to ask yourself, Given where they are now compared to fighting for podiums in 2023, what enjoyment and what motivation will that give to Fernando to fight for P6 or P5 on a good day if the team can't compete with McLaren or Ferrari? That is where the option of Mercedes and Red Bull I think could be more interesting, because it would give him a new motivation, hopefully further up the grid, that I think could make him want to stay longer. Having said that, even though the thought of Fernando at Mercedes replacing Lewis of all people is tantalizing, at the moment that's not even an upgrade on Aston Martin. Mercedes have had an embarrassing start to 2024, and without Alonso's penalty in Australia, Mercedes currently should be 5th in the Constructors' Championship. When you consider that Aston Martin have Lance Stroll in the other car, whilst Mercedes have what many people consider to be the strongest driver lineup on the grid, the reality is that Mercedes right now are the 5th best team in Formula 1 and have only gotten worse since the start of the ground effect era. Before the season began, Alonso at Mercedes made a lot of sense, because I think many people, and myself included, assumed that Mercedes was going to have a better car. Toto Wolff has made it clear with his comments that Mercedes' primary choice would actually be Kimi Antonelli if he proves himself to be good enough in his rookie F2 campaign. But if Antonelli needs another year, then Fernando is undoubtedly the closest short-term like-for-like replacement for Lewis. The problem with Mercedes right now is that I just don't see how it makes any sense for Alonso. First and foremost, even though we do have a long season to go, and the performance of the cars is going to fluctuate with upgrades, Mercedes hasn't shown any evidence of understanding this rule cycle yet. So not only is there no certainty that they'll improve this year, there is no evidence right now to say that they're going to get any better next year. That means that at best, Alonso would be making a sideways step, and even if we ignore that, Mercedes is not going to be a long-term home, because even if they do take Alonso, they already have an eye on his replacement before he's even stepped into the building. I also think the relationship with Toto will be a difficult one to cultivate, because Toto is already very loyal to Russell, he's already very loyal to Antonelli, and that driver-team principal bond is a very important one because, as we have seen with Red Bull and Mercedes, it allows the driver to feel more comfortable within the team and allows them to perform at their best. I think the teammate element is also an important one to talk about, because at Aston Martin, I am being deadly serious when I say that I think Fernando could race into his 50s and still beat Stroll over the course of the season. That in itself brings Alonso more stability at Aston Martin, because if you beat your teammate regardless of the circumstances, then you're always going to have a reason to be kept on. Up against Russell at Mercedes, whilst I think Fernando, all things being equal, would beat him in their very first season together, it's still not the comfortable number 2 driver situation that he has now at Aston Martin. Mercedes, Toto and George have a very long history together, and there is always the possibility that Alonso might just feel isolated within the team, in a very similar way to how he felt at McLaren in 2007, where after he left the team, he said that he felt as though he never received the full support of the team in the same way that Lewis did. Would this be the case of learning from the past, or repeating that same mistake? All in all, unless Alonso, similar to Lewis with Ferrari, has seen something in Mercedes and seen something at Aston Martin that makes him absolutely sure that Mercedes will improve in 2025 and that this is the right place for him to be in the twilight of his career, compared to the beginning of the season, I just don't think that there's enough reasons to go to Mercedes. In fact, as I record this right now, I don't see any reason for him to go to Mercedes. Not even for money, because I can't imagine that Toto and Mercedes are going to pay him that much more than Stroll and Aston Martin, who clearly see that they need a driver of Alonso's quality to be competitive. As the season has gone on, I think Mercedes has become less and less of an option for Fernando, and I don't think that they are the reason that Alonso has not yet re-signed with Aston Martin or announced his retirement. No, the team that's probably keeping Alonso and Aston Martin waiting is Red Bull. And now, I will say right from the off that as much as I would love to see a lineup of Max Verstappen and Fernando Alonso, because I think it might just be the greatest thing in the history of everything ever, There is no way that Horner, Marko, or anyone involved with the Red Bull organization would risk throwing a grenade like Fernando Alonso into the meat grinder that is Max Verstappen. As much as there would be a huge amount of respect between the two drivers, their combustible personalities and the fact that I think Fernando even now could give Max a seriously good run for his money, it just makes no sense at Red Bull. I also think what I said about Toto Wolff applies even more to an Alonso and Horner dynamic, because I think it would be fair to characterize their relationship over the years as respectful but spiky. Apart from Schumacher at Ferrari, I have never seen a team built around one individual to the same extent as Red Bull is around Max Verstappen, to the point where, as we saw in Jeddah, with Max publicly backing Marko and not Horner, Verstappen even now is getting involved in the Red Bull power struggle behind the scenes. Alonso would absolutely come into that environment as the outsider, and how that would affect him mentally and how that would affect his on-track performances would be very interesting to see. With Max at the team, even though I don't think Red Bull would even offer Fernando Checo's seat over someone like Sainz or Albon, if Fernando was offered a one-year deal to be Max's teammate, he would jump without even taking the time to blink to get back into not just a race-winning, but a dominant, championship-winning car, regardless of who his teammate would be. In the very, very unlikely but still possible scenario that Max might leave Red Bull early for a rebuild project at Mercedes, which, to be honest, I think is just more Toto Wolff trying to hype Max up in the media as a distraction from how bad their car is. Even in that very unlikely scenario, I just think that there's a little bit too much history between Alonso, Horner, Marko and Red Bull for Fernando to be the number one name on the list to replace Max. In the end, even though I would respect and understand Alonso's decision if he decided to retire, I think that he is still driving at such a high level that, to me, Aston Martin is still a very safe bet. From there, unless Red Bull somehow offer him a miracle drive as either Max's replacement or as his teammate, I would honestly pick retirement, Aston Martin or Red Bull before I would pick Mercedes. This season has already thrown us so many surprises, shocks and controversies that I wouldn't be surprised if there's yet another twist in the tail. But I think when it comes to the driver market, we are still waiting for that next big domino to fall that will then start the chain reaction. Will Max stay? Where will Sainz go? What will happen to Alex Albon? And what will all of that mean for Fernando Alonso and what he does next? Well, that is now what I want to know from you in the comments. Well, there you have it. If you did enjoy this video and want to support the channel, then don't forget to subscribe. That would be massively appreciated, and I'll see you in the next one.